Welcome to this Cambridge Alumni Festival talk on the Panama Railroad by Dr. Peter Pyne. I'm very pleased to have been asked to give a quick introduction. My name's Ed Paine, and my company, Last Frontiers, has been running alumni tours for Oxford and Cambridge for some years now. We're a specialist tour operator to Latin America and Antarctica, and we've organized trips to Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Peru. Now, in late February next year, we're organizing a tour to Panama. So I thought I'd mention it now because Peter will be our trip scholar. We're going to be traveling the route of the railroad, pretty much, which was vital in building the later canal, as you'll hear, I'm sure, and we'll visit modern and historical sites connected to the fascinating and colourful history of the Isthmus. If anyone would like any further details of this tour, just look at the Cambridge website or send me an email. There's a contact email for me at the bottom of the screen there. It's a short tour, just under a week. So if anyone wants to add on some personal travel before or afterwards, maybe Costa Rica, Colombia, something like that, that's close by, we can easily arrange it. Anyway, to today's talk. Peter and I have known each other for some time now. Peter was born in Dublin. He's got degrees in history, politics, Latin American studies, I think several of those, and his research into the Panama Railroad, which was a link as significant in its day as the Suez Canal was in its, began as a retirement project. But it's led to a book which has been widely praised for its engaging story, beautifully told, as I can attest, the Panama Railroad, which more later. As it said at the beginning, if you've got any questions during the talk, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, and I will do my best to summarize any and put them to Peter at the end of his talk. So without further ado, Peter, I'm going to put up your first slide, Central America and the US in 1850, and over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. As Ed has just said, I want to talk to you about a railway that was built 170 years ago across the Isthmus of Panama. That's the narrow neck of land that joins the continents of South and North America. You'll see it at the bottom of the slide there. I'll start by explaining the rationale for constructing a railroad in this rather remote location in the 1850s. I'll then briefly describe how the railroad was built before going on to assess the economic and political impact of its completion. We might as well start by asking, why is this rail link worth talking about in the first place? Well, the answer is that this short railway, less than 50 miles long, is unique in several ways and has an importance out of all proportion to its length. It was the world's first interoceanic railway, the first to link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. You can see from the map there that you have the Caribbean, which is part of the Atlantic, and then on the other side of Panama, you have the Pacific. It was one of the first railways to be built in Central and South America. Furthermore, it was one of the great engineering achievements of the time. It was also the most expensive railway to be built anywhere in the world in the 19th century. The cost per mile when it was eventually finished was $165,000 per mile in 1858. Not only was it costly to build, it was also expensive to travel on. It was the most expensive train journey in the world in terms of the price of a ticket per mile. A one-way ticket for a journey of just over 47 miles cost $25 back in the 1850s. For these reasons, the story of how the railroad was built and the thousands of men who struggled through swamps and jungle to complete it deserves to be more widely known. Let's start by asking, why was a railroad built across Panama in the 1850s? Well, starting in the decade of the 1840s, a growing number of settlers headed from the east and south of the US to what were then the distant Pacific territories of Oregon and California. A saying at that time summed up the three ways of getting to these remote lands: the Horn around, the plains across, or the Isthmus over. Well, the Horn refers to Cape Horn. So one way of getting from the East Coast to the West Coast of North America was a 15,000-mile journey from New York to San Francisco by sailing ship. This could take up to 6 months, and it was expensive, tedious, and sometimes dangerous journey because of the storms around South America, the bottom of South America. The plains across refers to the Great Plains, and this was for traveling by wagon train across the US. It could only be attempted in spring and summer because getting across the Rocky Mountains was impossible when winter came and the snows. This journey could take 4 months, and the migrants were exposed to heat, hardship, and the threat of attack by Native American Indians. Travel via Panama, the Isthmus of Panama, was the fastest route, but there was no organized system for crossing the isthmus. At that time, Panama was a province of New Granada, a country we know today as Colombia. Now, travelers who wanted to use this route sailed to Panama's Caribbean coast. So they came down from New York or New Orleans down to the Caribbean side of Panama. They then transferred to canoes up the Chagres River. If we could have a look at the slide, Ed, for the Chagres, the mouth of the Chagres. This is the mouth of the Chagres, Panama's biggest river. There was a port here at that time. It's since been overgrown by the jungle. It's no longer used. They transferred here from their ship to canoes and then sailed up or canoed up the river as far as upstream as the boats could reach. This is somebody still paddling up the Chagres River. They then, once they reached a place called Cruces, which was the headwaters of the, or as far upriver as canoes could go, they then transferred to muleback, or they walked the remaining 20 miles to Panama City on the Pacific. Then, once in Panama City, they awaited a ship to San Francisco. So the entire trip could take 6 weeks or longer. Crossing Panama at this time was uncomfortable, expensive, and often dangerous to the health of the travelers because of the prevalence of tropical fevers in its hot, steamy climate. As a result, only a tiny minority of migrants, a few hundred per year, opted for this route prior to 1849. It was at this point that a wealthy New York ship owner, William Aspinwall, came on the scene. He devised a plan to provide a faster, safer, and more comfortable transportation system that would link the east and west coasts of the United States via Panama. This required building a railroad across the isthmus, which would link up with connecting steamship services on the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Aspinwall's plan was ambitious at a time when railways were still in their infancy in the United States and when there were no trains west of the Mississippi River. We'll have a look at a picture of Aspinwall now. Aspinwall was a wealthy New York merchant, owner of one of the biggest clipper ship fleets in the world at the time, bringing tea from China. He was also a rather cultivated man, was one of the founders of or became one of the founders of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and also of the American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Aspinwall's timing could not have been better. He and his associates had established the Pacific Mail Steamship Company to operate between Panama and San Francisco just a few months before news of the California gold rush reached America's east coast at the end of 1848. Shortly afterwards, he and his colleagues also founded the Panama Railroad Company in New York. The discovery of gold in California set off a tidal wave of migration over the next decade. Tens of thousands of settlers and prospectors from the US and around the world flocked to California and Oregon. Aspinwall's scheme coincided perfectly with a huge increase in the number of migrants. I'll now say something about how the railroad was built. In October 1849, the directors of the newly established railroad appointed two experienced American engineers, George Totten and John Troutwine, as contractors. These engineers decided to start work on the railroad about midway across the isthmus, but they soon ran into serious problems. Transporting materials and supplies up the Chagres River proved to be difficult and hazardous. In addition, workers frequently deserted for easier and more lucrative employment elsewhere, and labor costs shot up because of the gold rush. These unforeseen problems forced Totten and Troutwine to ask the company to release them from their contract after just a few months. The future of the railroad now hung in the balance. The company's directors decided to press ahead, but not before making two important changes to operations. Firstly, construction was switched to Manzanillo Island, just off the Caribbean coast, in May 1850. This became the Atlantic terminus of the railroad. Secondly, the company took over responsibility for building the railroad itself, retaining Totten and Troutwine as salaried engineers. If we could have a look now at the railroad route, you'll see at the top of the map Manzanillo Island, and then the route of the railroad roughly north-south down to Panama City, and also the various stations on the way. The engineers soon found that Manzanillo Island was not a good site from which to start construction. It was barely above sea level and several hundred yards from the shore. The surrounding coastal area around Limon or Navy Bay was low-lying, and the tracks would have to cross miles of mangrove swamps before reaching firm ground further inland. Men had to work up to their waists in waters infested with poisonous snakes and crocodiles. And we have a look now at the mangrove swamp slide. Well, two slides here. The one on the right is taken from a book published in the 19th century, showing rather I suppose, exaggerated view of the mangrove, or portrait of the mangrove swamps. And the one on the left, the photograph on the left, is one I took myself, but you can see the sort of idea of the terrain that the railroad builders would first have to deal with to get tracks laid across this swampy ground, where they were also densely forested. Engineers and their workers had to contend with torrential tropical downpours because Panama's Caribbean coast is subject to rain for about 2/3 of the year. Mosquitoes, sandflies, and all sorts of nasty insects abounded, and malaria and other tropical diseases were endemic. Not surprisingly, some laborers fell ill. Others deserted, seeking easier and better paid employment elsewhere on the isthmus or in California. A discouraged trout wine resigned at the end of 1850 and returned to the United States, leaving Totten in sole charge. Construction dragged on slowly throughout 1851. By October of that year, only 8 miles of track had been laid, most of it on piles driven into the swamps, and the company had exhausted most of its capital. We look at the virgin forest slide now. This gives you, again, this is an illustration from a book of the period, giving you an idea of the densely forested nature of the terrain where the railroad had to be built. Totten, disillusioned by his slow progress and weakened by recurrent illnesses, recommended that the company should hand the project over to another contractor. The directors accepted his advice, and in June 1852, an experienced American railroad builder called Story assumed responsibility for completing the project by August 1853. Story's progress, however, failed to meet expectations. The tender that he had submitted to win the contract was underpriced, probably around about $75,000 per mile, which was just under half of the real cost. This low price tender probably reflected his prior lack of experience of laying tracks over difficult terrain in a tropical fever-ridden climate. He had failed to allow for the cost of recruiting sufficient workers to finish the job on time. But fate also dealt him 2 strokes of bad luck. In the first case, there were outbreaks of cholera in 1852 and yellow fever in 1853, and these depleted his workforce. Then he'd almost completed a huge wooden bridge, more than 600 feet long, over the Chagres River when a sudden flood in April 1853 destroyed it. The river could rise dramatically after heavy rains in the hills. Now look at another slide, the primeval forest. Again, this shows you the some of the trees that men had to chop down. Some of these were enormous, with girths of 20 or 30 feet and heights of over 100 feet. And they had to be cut down by axe. There were no mechanical aids to help them, no chainsaws. Story withdrew from Panama in 1853, in September 1853, having failed to fulfill his contract. Despite this major setback, the Panama Railroad Company opted to press ahead. It again took over responsibility for completing the line under the leadership of Totten, the chief engineer. By this stage, over 3 years had elapsed since the project's start, and less than 30 miles of track had been laid. a new threat to the railroad now emerged. Cornelius Vanderbilt, a millionaire shipping tycoon, was promoting a new route to the American West via Nicaragua. Vanderbilt's alternative route was attracting a growing number of travelers. Could we see the map of Central America again? And you'll see that Nicaragua is slightly to the north of Panama, and it's closer to the United States. Vanderbilt's ships brought passengers to Nicaragua, transported them by river and lake across to the Pacific coast, and then carried them to California. Because Nicaragua was closer to the US than Panama, Vanderbilt's route was slightly faster. The Panama Railroad Company responded to this threat to its existence by speeding up the pace of construction in a frantic attempt to finish the line as soon as possible. It embarked on a campaign to recruit a small army of workers from different parts of the globe. In addition to its previous source of labor recruitment in the United States and New Granada, men were hired from China, Jamaica, and Ireland. By the end of 1854, between 5,000 and 7,000 men were hacking and digging their way through Panama's rainforests and hills. The railroad's initiative paid off. At midnight on January the 27th, 1855, a little over 5 years after construction had started, the final rails were laid. For the first time in history, trains now connected two of the world's great oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. Unfortunately, no photographers were present to record the event. Now show you another slide, men on a hand car. This form of transportation was used to move the engineers and administrators, the technical staff from one part of the line to the other, where the use of an engine, a locomotive, wasn't required. What's also interesting here is the way the tracks are raised above the level of the swamp down below. I'd now like to say a few words about the workers who built this railway. While there is no official record of the number of employees hired during the course of construction, I estimate the total to be about 17,500. These men came from four main sources. About 7,000 Spanish-speaking laborers came from New Granada, including Panama, and from adjoining Central American republics. The second main source were 6,000 white men who were hired in the United States. A minority were technical, managerial, and medical personnel, but most of these men were laborers or semi-skilled workers. Evidence suggests that many of the white laborers, possibly 60% of them, were Irish immigrants who had been employed in construction and in building railways and canals in the US. A third source of men were 3,000 or so West Indian workers, mainly from Jamaica. And finally, just over 1,000 Chinese indentured laborers were imported from the south of China, over 700 of them in a famous clipper ship called the Sea Witch. So we'll have a look at the painting of the Sea Witch. This was one of Aspinwall's ships that brought tea from China to New York. It was a famous ship in its day. It brought over 700 Chinese. Took them 60 days to get to Panama. In addition to the men I've mentioned already, several hundred Indian and Malay workers who had migrated to Jamaica were also hired. Finally, 360 men were recruited in Cork and shipped to Panama. I'll talk about these in more detail in a minute. The Panama Railroad was therefore an early example of a multi-ethnic and multilingual workforce. The railroad was possibly the first American corporation to establish what was then a new pattern of global labor recruitment. I'll now say something about the men from Cork. Towards the end of 1853, the railroad sent its vice president, Colonel Centre, to Ireland as part of this global effort to recruit more manpower. The company had contacted Irish workhouses to see if they were interested in disposing of some of their inmates by allowing the railroad to recruit them for work in Panama. Irish workhouses were still crowded with thousands of destitute survivors of the disastrous Great Famine of 1845-51. However, the workhouse in Cork City was the only one to respond to the railroad's overtures. The company hoped to recruit 1,000 labourers, masons and quarrymen from the workhouse and from the Cork region. Press advertisements in local newspapers sought men for a 6-month period for $1 a day, all found, with a free trip from Panama to New Orleans or New York at the end of their contract. Centre chartered a large sailing vessel in Liverpool, the Ben Nevis, to take his Irish recruits to Panama. So we can have a look at, we have a slide of that now. The Ben Nevis was a ship originally built for the emigrant trade from Britain to Australia, and could carry close to 1,000 passengers. The vice president was surprised to find that unfavorable reports from Irishmen who had previously worked on the railroad had filtered back to Ireland. Scathing accounts of conditions in Panama appeared in Cork's newspapers and undermined his attempts to recruit the 1,000 men he needed. When the Ben Nevis left Cork in December 1853, heading for Panama, a total of 360 men were on board. He didn't get the 1,000 he wanted. 133 of these were inmates of the Cork workhouse, together with another 230 men from the city and other parts of the country. Using the workhouse records, I was able to find the names and some details of the inmates who had volunteered for Panama. About 2/3 of them were young, single men between 14 and 20 years old, desperate to escape from the grim conditions in the workhouse and attracted by the promise of a free ticket to the US once their contract was up. They were possibly unaware of what they were facing in Panama. What were working conditions like for other railways labourers? Well, employees were required to sign up for a period of 6 months. Labourers were paid $1 per day, with small variations depending on ethnicity. The main exception was the Chinese. As indentured workers, they earned only $4 per month. Food, accommodation, medical and travel costs were paid for by the company. Labourers worked an exhausting 12 hours a day from sunrise to sunset, under a tropical sun, in high temperatures and energy-sapping humidity. They toiled 6 days per week, Sunday being their only day off. The labourers had no mechanical aids to help them, apart from pile drivers, steam launches, and some railway engines where the tracks had been laid. Almost all work had to be done by hand, with some assistance from horses and mules. At first, the men had no proper accommodation. They slept in the holds of 2 old ships anchored just off Manzanillo Island. They later moved into tents, and these were gradually replaced by wooden shacks or shanties built on stilts to raise them above the marsh. We can have a look at one of these shanties now. You can see there the swampy nature of the terrain. Most of the food needed to feed the men had to be shipped in from New York. In logistical terms, what the company achieved was not dissimilar to maintaining a small army in the field, 2,000 miles from its headquarters. The company saw no need to provide recreational or leisure facilities for its gangs of workers scattered across the jungle and swamps of the isthmus. In the 1850s, Panama had only one public hospital located in the capital. This forced the company to provide its own medical facilities, staffed by physicians and surgeons recruited in the US. The provision of medical care in the company's hospitals was costly, particularly if men had to remain there for any length of time. The railroad found that it was cheaper in many cases to send sick men back home rather than keep them in hospital in Panama. For this reason, the company repatriated large numbers of sick employees to their places of origin before the end of their contract period. An unknown number of these invalids died on the return trip or not long afterwards. Once back home, the survivors had to fend for themselves at no further cost to the company. The number of deaths among the railroad's employees is a controversial subject, with estimates ranging from a few hundred to tens of thousands. So a huge range, and no agreement on this. The railroad company claimed that only 293 white workers had died by 1855, a figure which is quite implausible. The company remained quiet about deaths in other ethnic groups, and no comprehensive record of the number of men who died has survived. The civil authorities in Panama did not keep death records at this time, and so we do not have an independent source of statistics on mortality in Panama for the 1850s. Panama was clearly an unhealthy location, particularly for white outsiders. Malaria was endemic, cholera, yellow fever, dysentery, smallpox, typhoid, and other diseases were also prevalent. Sunstroke was another danger for men who had to labor under an equatorial sun. On the other hand, a contract to work in Panama for 6 months was not an automatic death sentence. This is evident from newspaper reports of men returning to their homes at the end of their contracts. Some employees even volunteered to go back for a second or third time, something they were most unlikely to do if they thought it was going to end in death. How then are we to arrive at an approximate mortality rate for the railroad workers? I used an incomplete set of death records for a French company that attempted unsuccessfully to build a canal across Panama in the 1880s. This was 30 years after the railroad was completed. These statistics suggested that about 24% of its employees died. There are valid grounds for arguing that the railroad's workforce suffered from a similar mortality rate. This presumed 24% death rate would not have applied uniformly to all of the railroad's employees, but would have varied among different ethnic groups. It would have been somewhat lower for men born and raised in a tropical environment, and it would be higher, perhaps between 28 and 33% for white workers with unprepared immune systems coming from more temperate climatic zones. If my estimate of an overall 24% mortality rate is correct, somewhere in the region of 4,200 men died building this railroad. Well, to conclude, I'd like to talk about the impact that the opening of the railroad had. This short railroad had an economic and political impact out of all proportion to its length. Trips between the east and west coasts of the United States now took less time, 3 weeks instead of the 6 or more weeks previously required. Conditions for travelers greatly improved. Passengers left a ship on one ocean in the morning got on a train and were aboard another ship on the opposite ocean by nightfall. They no longer had to worry about falling victim to tropical fevers or of being attacked by bandits on their way across Panama. We look at the slide now, railway station at Aspinwall. Aspinwall was the port, the new port built on Manzanillo Island, which was the Caribbean or Atlantic terminus of the railroad. And a whole new city developed on this island. We can see here, this would have been later in the 1800s, the train starting to load up. People came off ships and were able to then directly board the railway train to take them across to the Pacific side. And for many years afterwards, the Aspinwall was called after the founder of the railroad, was almost an American enclave within Panama, operated and controlled by the railway company. The railroad proved to be an outstanding financial success. For 2 decades after its opening, it was the best paying investment of its kind in the world. Its shares were the highest quoted on the New York Stock Exchange in 1868. With an initial capital of $8 million, its total earnings from 1855 to 1898 amounted to $95 million, while operating expenses came to $57 million, yielding a profit of $38 million. Not bad for an investment of $8 million. Between 1856 and 1866, the railroad carried several hundred tons of gold and silver from the mines of California and Nevada. The gold was worth over 500 million. It carried over $147 million in silver, 19 million in paper money, and 5 million in jewelry. By facilitating the secure transportation of gold and silver from the mines of California and Nevada across Panama, from where they were shipped to New York, the railroad helped establish that city as America's undisputed financial and investment center. The railroad also played a key role in the development of the western states of the US. It provided the only rail link between America's Atlantic and Pacific states until the completion of the transcontinental line across the US in 1869. So for about 14, 15 years, the Panama Railroad had a more or less monopoly of rail travel between the east and west of the US. The rail connection across Panama facilitated the huge migration of settlers from the east to the west in the US during the second half of the 19th century. In the 10 years following its completion, this single track carried almost 400,000 passengers. The railroad helped the Union Army to victory in the Civil War in the 1860s by facilitating the transportation of troops and equipment from the country's western territories to the battlefields of the South and the East. The railroad also played an important part in transforming global trading patterns. By providing rapid and secure transportation of goods and merchandise between Europe on the one hand and countries bordering the Pacific on the other, it helped to lay some of the foundations of today's global trading economy. Paradoxically, the railway contributed to an economic recession in Panama. Most of the railroad's locally recruited laborers became unemployed after 1855. The railroad now monopolized transport across the isthmus, undermining the livelihood of thousands of Panamanians who had previously serviced the lucrative transit trade. Up to 1855, local people had provided food, accommodation, transport and entertainment for the thousands of migrants crossing the isthmus. They'd also provided the or assisted the transportation of goods and merchandise, bringing them upriver and in boats and canoes and transporting them by mule. All of that ended in 1855. Prosperity was replaced by poverty for many Panamanians, leading to an attack on the railroad's Pacific terminus in 1856. The railroad was blamed for this economic collapse. In geopolitical terms, the Panama Railroad provided one of the foundation stones of America's informal empire in Latin America. This was really at the very start of the expansion of American influence, North American influence in Latin America. British and French entrepreneurs had failed to grasp the opportunity to provide a modern transport system across the Isthmus of Panama. And this left the way open for an American enterprise, contributing to the decline of British influence in Central America. Nevertheless, British investors quickly realized the importance of the railroad, and they invested in it and reportedly owned over half of the company's shares by 1865. Without the aid of this railway, the Panama Canal could not have been built across Panama 50 years later by the United States. The railroad played a crucial role in the construction of this massive project by moving vast quantities of rock and earth. During the 10 years of the canal excavation, from 1904 to 1914, it was the busiest railway in the world, with over 200 trains in operation every day. We now look at a slide, the railroad through the jungle today. This is part of the stretch of partial stretch of the railroad today, and you can see the forest, the rainforest on either side. Today, the railway, now known as the Panama Canal Railroad, continues to operate passenger and freight services almost 170 years after its opening. Nowadays, the transportation of 500,000 or more containers each year between huge cargo ships at either end of the canal provides the bulk of its income. It does provide some passenger services, but freight is now its big earner. The ships that are now docking, or some of the ships that are docking at either end of the canal, are just too big to navigate the canal, so their containers are offloaded onto freight wagons and then moved across the Panama and loaded again at the other side within a matter of hours. The glory for completing the railroad went to its founders and engineers. The thousands of men of different nationalities who built the line, often at the cost of their health and frequently their lives, have been ignored and largely forgotten. Many of these men are buried in Mount Hope Cemetery near the city of Cologne. This neglected burial ground with its gravestones mouldering under a tropical sun is a melancholy sight. We have some slides of that. This is where a lot of the men are buried. There's another slide. I hope I have been able to convey to you a little about the history of this unique railroad and to make the story of the men who built this line more widely known. You'll find a lot more information in my book entitled The Panama Railroad, published by Indiana University Press. It's available online and at most good bookshops for between 35 and 40 pounds. I think we have a cover of the book. Coming up. Panama is a fascinating country with an appealing blend of the old and the new. It's got some interesting historical connections with the UK as well, as during the colonial period, British pirates and buccaneers and naval forces made their presence felt on the isthmus. I hope that some of you listening will be encouraged to sign up to a tour of Panama that is being organized by the Last Frontiers travel company next spring. Edward Paine from Last Frontiers will give you a few more details in a minute. I should add that Panama's hot sunny weather in February and March is a wonderful antidote to a cold British spring. In conclusion, I would like to thank the Cambridge Alumni Festival for giving me this opportunity to speak, and to all of you for listening. And I now hand you over to Edward Paine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Absolutely fascinating. As ever, I have read your wonderful book and would highly recommend it to anyone. It's beautifully written and really brings this fascinating project to life. Yes, on our trip, we will be taking the train from one side to the other, and the canal probably in the other direction. So we're trying to see a bit of everything. Peter, no actual questions at this point. I'm not sure if anyone can see what comes up in the Q&A, but Daryl Francis did make a comment, more of a comment really, about death rates, saying one comparator would be death rates on the tropical Thai-Burma death railway in 1942-45, when about 20% of Allied prisoners and possibly 50% of Asian labourers, that was the death rate, and the survivors were younger ones. So that's quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I know, having read your book, that you took many different sort of death statistics into account when you were coming up with your own estimate. I actually just had one question for you. I know it's not directly in the same time period, but we do now have the canal, and presumably when the canal, in particular Lake Gatun, was flooded,
Yes.
the railway, the original route of the railway must have had to change. And I wondered how much of the original railway had to sort of be relocated.
Yeah, most of it, I think, is the answer, Ed. The stretches at the beginning and at the end are close to the, or probably follow the original line of the railroad. But as you say, the need to provide a huge reservoir of water to operate the locks in the canal meant that a lot of the central part, the central portion of Panama had to be flooded, and that the original rail, much of the original rail tracks are now under 50-60 feet of water in Lake Gatun. So it was, yeah, largely relocated along the side of the canal because of the work required to build the canal and provide water for the reservoir.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, Peter, it's that was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. There are no other pending questions. I'm sure you answered and raised a lot of points that are so interesting to us all today. But so thank you on behalf of everyone who is watching, and to those who are watching, I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.